So I just finished a video for you all on the question of God's divine will and whether or not it can be counted as free if it's unchanging. And I talked about how a scholar named Eleanor Stump has asked or tried to posit a view of God's divine or of the divine will, which can exist both necessarily and contingently. And as it exists contingently, it can rightly be called free will. I see where she's getting this from Aquinas, and I think it's a very interesting way of thinking through the matter. I'm not 100% sure I agree with her, and one of the reasons that I have some concerns is because I worry that maybe she is boiling down, she seems to be coming up with something other than God as his will. And I would say that God is his will. So there might be some issues that crop up there. Another way around some of the problems that come up, though, rather than saying that God's will can exist necessarily and contingently in two modes of being, another way of going through it would be to say, well, what do we mean by free? And this is the primary way that we discussed it in class. So a traditional modern approach, that is an approach after the time of John Locke and some of the other empiricists of his day, we have generally started to think of free will as the ability to choose one thing from another or the other thing from the one, and just have those choices set before us and nothing constraining us to choose one or the other. But I don't think this is the only way that we can conceptualize free will. Indeed, I would say that free will is ultimately a will which is oriented and able to do that which is good. Again, a will which is oriented and able to do that which is good. So in this sense, if I was to have multiple choices in front of me, simply the ability to choose one or the other, I do not think is the primary thing that we should be understanding as the goal of the free will, but instead having the potency which can then be actualized so that I can make the choice that would be good for me, or I can bring about the result that will be good for me. And so it seems very clear from this that there's going to be two things that will affect my free will and what it ends up reaching out and grabbing and attaining, which is that what I understand the good to be and what the good actually is. Or maybe I can make this more conditional. What I understand the good for me to be and what the good for me actually is. And by for me, I just simply mean as a human being. We know that as a human being, we can look back to Augustine for this, that God is the ultimate good for me, right? He is my end. He is my fulfillment. He is my final goal, right? He is the one that I come from and the one that I return back to. And so this is what we ultimately mean by being able to be free, is being able to move to God in some very real sense. So then the question is free will just simply that the ability to choose other than God? And I would say not necessarily. And indeed, I would say that Jesus had no such ability to choose other than himself, and yet he was entirely free. Freedom in this sense is actually just being more real, being the realist that you could possibly be, because it means that you're actually able to actualize the good that you were created for. So what's going to get in the way of free will then? Well, my intellect can be a problem. And here I don't just mean the rational side of my mind, which is going to conceptualize things as good and bad and then work through things in a very deductive or inductive sort of way and come up with an answer which I can box in my paper. Certainly it includes that. But it would also mean things that I come to snap decisions on. I might decide that something is good, and then by deciding that it is good, I will go out and do it. Indeed, that is what the will does. The will does what you already conceive of as good. And so as my intellect begins to look out at the world and see that which is good, my will reach out and try to attain that. the more my intellect is blinded by blinded to reality, the less I will actually be able to see, perceive, and attain that which is good. And if I'm not able to do that, I will become less and less free. Why? Because I will lose that potency to do the good, which would be the definition of free will that we're operating with. And so you could think of it like this. One of the best examples that is often used is severe drug or alcohol addiction, such that you cannot, after a certain point in time, really be able to reach yourself up by yourself. You can't really pull yourself up by your bootstraps at a certain point where it seems like you are just completely entrenched in your own misery. Now, I wouldn't say that you are like all of your free will is ever actually lost. The ability, at very least, God is always going to extend the grace to be able to pray, and that is a grace that's given to him or given from him. At very least in this life, I think that grace is always opened for us. And yet, the more that I engage in such choices of non-being, the less that I have ability then to exist freely. This is a very different way of conceptualizing free will. Now, you might ask, if we're actually able to operate so freely, how then can God use our free actions and our free choices, which are choices to the good, or failure to these choices to the good because of like I said, a misfiring in my conceptualization, my intellect, all these things? How might then God use these to bring about his ends? Now, you could just simply say, well, God knows what I'm going to do. And in knowing what I'm going to do, he simply sets things up in accordance with what I'm going to do, right? Perhaps I am going to, perhaps I'm just going to go do something stupid, on my way to the grocery store, and because that isn't in accord with God's will, he drops a tree on my car, and now I'm not able to go to the grocery store. I don't know. You can fill in the example with whatever you want. So maybe God uses things that are apart from my will to bring about his end. That's possible. The difficulty with that then, though, is it seems like if you're going to set up the world in this way, you have God looking at us, seeing what we're going to do and reaching out to God, and then adjusting circumstances accordingly. And this is fine when it comes to issues of sin. It's a lot bigger of a problem, though, when it comes to issues of us receiving God's grace, because it seems like at the end of the day, he's standing back and seeing if we're ultimately going to be responsive to his grace and then acting accordingly. Why is that an issue? Well, it's a big issue for something known as Pelagianism or semi-Pelagianism, which is going to suggest that God is ultimately the first mover as it comes to our grace, our graces that we receive, right? He is ultimately the one that moves us. And so you might say, well, but if I'm to be free, how can he be the one that's moving me to this freedom? This seems like he's entrapped me and forced me now just to be gazing upon him. And now I don't have any solution against the worldview which says that God would allow things like sin and evil to exist in order for us to be free individuals. Aquinas takes the route of saying that he gives us, he causes us to be freely causes of his own plan. In other words, he is such an effective and efficient cause that as he causes us and uses us as instruments, he does so without hindering the freedom that we operate under. Now he could cause other things to serve their own ends non-freely. He does this with rocks and animals. But for humans, he does so through their freedom. Now, how that can be is a bit of a mystery, right? You might say that it's just a contradiction of terms. And indeed, I sometimes wonder if there's something going on here as well, which is why you might want to approach this from a couple of different angles too, like the one I offered in the last video. But here, at very least, you can say, okay, so perhaps God is able to use me as a cause, albeit as a free cause, to bring about his divine will. I think that at least sounds plausible, even if there is a mysterious element. It still continues to solve the questions that we were contemplating at the beginning of this week, namely, how can sin ever come to be? Now, that's in rough scare quotes here, right? Or how can evil come to be, right? Why is it in scare quotes? Because we know that evil is not being at all. Indeed, it's non-being. But to talk about evil in such a way is to ascribe being to it in some sense. And so here we're just practicing kind of an insanity of language where we talk about things that don't exist as if they exist. As you probably can see by now, this is a complicated topic. I've spent probably 3 or 4 videos, some of them a little bit more rambly than others, to get us to see all the issues at play. There are a number of other ways of solving the issues than the ones that we've addressed, but I think the ones we've addressed are more interesting than some of those other ways. I'll let you be the judge of that. If you want to contemplate the relationship between being and freedom more, I'd love to talk about that with you. Please let me know. There's plenty more here to be addressed. For now, though, we'll begin moving on to the next topic, namely, is God unchangeable or is he immutable? And this will also bring us into the question of, can God bring about logical contradictions? In other words, next week's Quote the Bet will be on, can God create a rock that he can't lift? That gets into the question of, can God change, right? By being unable to lift something that he otherwise was not unable to lift. And also, can God do something like making a square circle or an unmarried bachelor? Is this even sensical? Unsurprisingly, I will argue no, in line with much of the Christian tradition. These things are nonsensical, and I think it comes out of God's immutability. But we'll get there all in due time. I look forward to those conversations. I'll see you then.